Good morning and welcome to the Solar Land Leasing and Municipal Best Practices webinar co-hosted by the New York State Energy Democracy Alliance and the New York State Solar Energy Industry Association. I'm really pleased to be working with NYSEIA. This is a very important issue and we're going to get started very quickly. I just want to briefly say a few things about the New York Energy Democracy Alliance and my role in that as coordinator of the Community-Owned Shared Renewables Working Group. So our organization is about a year and a half old, and our focus is to advance a just and participatory transition to a resilient, localized, and democratically controlled clean energy economy in New York State. Really the bottom line here is that the folks who are low income, people of color, frontline communities, and others, including those geographically excluded from clean energy benefits, need to benefit from the big changes and huge opportunities that are coming with the REV and with the explosion of the solar market in New York. The Community-Owned Shared Renewables Working Group was established in order to provide the information, technical assistance, and other support that community organizations and municipalities might need if either they wish to develop their own shared renewables projects or they wish to be partners with a private developer and they really want to know what they're doing in that partnership. At cosharenys.org we've created a toolbox that is designed for those aforementioned community developers, and that's where we're archiving the information that we glean from other states as well as information about projects that we are developing. The reason why this issue is so important to us is that it's very important both to, I think, the industry as well. I won't speak for it, but certainly for the Alliance and for my own home organization, the Binghamton Regional Sustainability Coalition based in the Southern Tier, that the benefit of this solar development definitely make a difference in terms of jobs and economic prosperity in communities across the state. We want to make sure that there's an appropriate balance of land use between energy development of clean kinds such as solar and wind as well as agricultural development, and we want to make sure that everybody's getting a fair deal. The final thing I will say is that because of a certain large company that blanketed the state with leases that may not be very representative of what you would find out there in general from the industry, there have been a flurry of sessions organized across the state to respond to the many, many calls and emails coming from landowners and farmers alike to Cooperative Extension, Farm Bureau, municipalities wondering what is this thing and what should I do in terms of solar leasing. Some of these sessions have been of very good quality, principally in the Hudson Valley, in the Capital District. Some of them in our backyard here in the Southern Tier have not been so good. And what we want to try and do is make sure good information comes out that folks can use both to answer the questions that they're fielding from their constituents and their members, and then get down a little bit closer to the grassroots where we have the resources to do so. With that, I'm going to pass it off to Valessa Suter-Klein from NYSEIA, who is going to talk about their organization and introduce our presenter.
Excellent. Thanks, Adam. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. My name is Valessa Suter-Klein, and I am the policy coordinator for the New York Solar Energy Industries Association. Founded in 1994, NYSEIA is the only statewide membership and trade association dedicated to advancing solar energy use in New York. We work to achieve responsible, sustainable solar energy adoption and create jobs that benefit our communities and also reduce environmental impacts from fossil fuels. We've received a number of questions from, our stakeholders, our membership, and communities across the state regarding this important issue of land leasing, and we're excited to see, all the attention and interest in solar installations across the state, and we look forward to sharing information and offering educational information about this. Before we proceed, A couple housekeeping items. We are recording this presentation, and I will share a link to the webinar to this list as well as people who were unable to join us by the end of this week. We will be saving time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. If you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A or the Ask a Question option on your control panel. We won't be unmuting everyone because we have a number of people on this webinar. All right, our presenter today is Melissa Kemp. Melissa serves as the co-chair of the NYSEIA Policy Committee and on the NYSEIA board as well. Melissa is the Director of Government and Utility Affairs for Renovis Solar, a solar development, engineering, procurement, and construction firm based in central New York. Melissa has been deeply involved in solar land leasing, solar siting and permitting processes and issues, and has focused and led efforts on state solar policy, including solar interconnection, property tax issues, the current interim successor tariff or net metering proceeding, and the clean energy standard, just to name a few.
Great, and with that, thank you, Valessa. Welcome, everyone. This is Melissa Kemp, and I look forward to kind of walking through this topic today with all of you. So we wanted to kick off this presentation simply by just kind of giving some quick context. Obviously, a lot of you have heard a lot about solar, but we want to just kind of make sure that the frame is as data-driven as possible. So just obviously, we're here today talking about solar photovoltaics, producing electricity. It's a key source of clean electricity for New York, and absolutely an essential part of a transition to a renewable energy system or infrastructure. We have been putting in solar in New York, as many of you know, for about a decade now, actually over a decade. But recent both cost reductions, some innovative policy updates, and now some ongoing kind of corrections to how we measure the cost of things, a lot of costs that we've excluded from our energy costs to date. We're finally seeing solar scale up in New York beyond just a residential kind of small systems into larger commercial, industrial, municipal systems, community systems, and then hopefully utility scale systems as well. And so the two key policies that have been driving this transition in recent years, particularly the last 12 to 18 months, there's two of them. One is the clean energy standard that has been talked a lot about recently, which, as most of you have heard, is a state mandate for 50% of our electricity in New York to come from renewable sources by 2030. And the exact form of this clean energy standard is currently being debated and decided at the Public Service Commission. There's the case number there for any of you who are not involved but are curious. And the goal, obviously, is to bring larger facilities, not just residential and commercial, but larger facilities online in a greater and quicker way with a very concrete, not just goal, but requirement that we need to achieve by 2030. So it's a very exciting time to see that happening. Alongside it has been the Reforming the Energy Vision proceeding, which has been going on since the spring of 2014. And that's been all about how do we kind of restructure, reevaluate our electric utility business here in New York to encourage the above transition, to make it a win-win for the utilities as well as for ratepayers and communities, to clean up our electrical system as quickly as possible, to keep costs down, reduce costs, and improve resiliency and choice. So in terms of New York and solar, right now about just over 0.5%, going on 1% of New York's annual electricity is actually coming from solar. And this number is still pretty small despite the amount of solar we've deployed in terms of number of systems, because a lot of it's been residential. So now as New York is finally really stepping into the larger scale solar deployment, we really expect that number to increase rapidly. Second point that I think is always just important to remind everyone, we have a good solar resource here in New York. We sure as heck don't feel like it in the middle of winter when it's snowy or cloudy for months on end. But we have 30 years of meteorological data, and that shows again and again that we have about 2/3 of the annual solar resource of Southern California, San Diego-ish, or Arizona, for example, some of the best areas in the country. And so we do well here. When you see pictures of a solar array covered in snow, that's okay. Like, we plan for that. We know about that. The snow comes at the least optimal time of year for the resource anyway. And so despite the feeling that we're in cloudy New York, we actually do have a good solar resource, and we have tons and tons of data to support that. For folks where this will mean anything at this point, people in other kind of presentations have often just kind of asked, what does a megawatt of solar in New York produce? The important part is that 2/3 of what some of the best areas in the country do, but if you're looking for an actual number, it is about 1,175 to about 1,325 megawatt hours per year per megawatt of solar. And if that doesn't mean anything to you right now, don't worry about it, but I just wanted to state that since people have been curious. So solar itself, is no longer a new technology. It's been proven to be, reliable. There's incredibly long warranties on equipment. It's known for having low maintenance requirements. And this is not a wild, wild west. I mean, the equipment itself is tested and rated extensively for efficiency, for safety. The industry itself is becoming, more and more regulated, but has been regulated for some time by various bodies, including the New York Public Service Commission, as well as New York State in terms of the Uniform Building Code, or Uniform Code, which includes electrical and building, and then of course local permitting and zoning rules. So just a couple other high-level things to check on or to point out. People often ask about the intermittency of solar, and I don't want to talk a lot about that here, but it is something that is completely manageable. It does not pose any kind of near-term barrier to development of solar. When we get to a certain level of solar and wind penetration, which we are still quite far from and are trying to move towards, then it is something that we want to deal with, and we do know how to mitigate that. In addition, solar itself, all of this kind of development and what's happening now to ramp that up has a whole bunch of economic pieces as well. And the economic pieces that I think mean most to municipalities, to communities, are the number of jobs. So right now the industry is employing over 8,000 people in the state, and this number is increasing quite a bit every year. The economics on the customer level, so if any of you have gone solar yourselves or are thinking about it for your home, for your business, for your town, those are typically projects where people are seeing economic sense from day one, where they do not have to put up upfront capital of their own if they don't want to, and can save 10 to 15% at a minimum through that type of decision to go solar. In addition, as more and more larger facilities are coming online, what I was saying is that other folks are getting involved in the economic benefits more clearly as well, and those include landowners, municipalities, and local economies in terms of business development and job creation. So with that, let's get on to the actual core of what we wanted to talk about today, which is really land use, land leasing, and municipal best practices. So first on the list is land use. So number one, just wanted to make a quick comment about timing of this. So right now in New York we have commercial scale facilities, which means up to about projects that take about 10 to 12 acres per project. Those are being built now. They have been being built in small amounts since 2013 and ramping up most recently since mid last year, mid 2015, when New York finally brought on a full-time program to kind of focus and support those kind of facilities. So right now, the largest amount of land that a single project could use is about 12 acres. Now, projects can go side by side, of course, and everything else, but generally that's the kind of scale that we are just kind of ramping up into. Right now, we do not have any utility scale facilities or solar facilities here in New York, at least in most of the state. There are one or two on Long Island that were done in a different way, but utility scale solar has not yet become a reality in New York. And through the Clean Energy Standard, if that's successful, it may, but probably will not come online at all really until 2018 or later. And these facilities of utility, when I say utility scale, we're talking about up to about 50 megawatts. And that's utility scale, but it's still nowhere near what people in other states with totally different climates and topographies are building. So just to put it in context, some of California's largest facilities, Nevada's largest facilities are about 500 megawatts, so 10 times the size. And both these types of facilities, the commercial that we are starting to see now and the utility that we hopefully will see down the road but are not like a today reality, both of those are very common in other states. And those states include, California, of course, but also, North Carolina and Massachusetts. So just that's the kind of important context for timing. On location, solar has been and will continue to be deployed on rooftops. People love putting solar on roofs when it makes sense. Same with over parking lots. The roof challenge is that sometimes you just can't fit what you need, or roofs have other, maintenance and kind of issues in terms of compatibility at a particular moment. Parking lots are lovely but are very expensive still. So in a lot of parts of New York, it's very difficult to make those pencil or make economic sense. So those things will both continue, but a lot of solar is going to be ground mounted. It has been and will increasingly be important to be able to put these things on the ground. And to give you some context for how much space solar takes up, 1 megawatt of solar on the DC side, that's what the little DC is, requires about 5 to 7 acres of land. But it's really interesting and important to note that 60% of that land, that 5 to 7 acres, is being left as open space because there's huge amounts of space between the rows of solar itself. And then even more importantly, perhaps, over 99% of that acreage is left as pervious surface. And I'll talk a bit more about what that means, but it means existing or new vegetation. So we are not covering these with, we're not paving them, we're not doing concrete underneath them, we're not doing gravel underneath them typically. We're leaving natural vegetation, which is, I think, a really positive thing. So some features of land that's being sought. So as would be kind of everyone's guess, previously cleared or disturbed land is definitely the first preference. No one's seeking, or typically no one's seeking to go out there and to chop down a forest unless there was some special reason to do so. Generally, there's lots and lots of land in our state that has been cleared or disturbed at some time in the past, and that's definitely the first choice. Land that's active for agriculture currently is not being sought specifically, but definitely can be suitable based on the landowner's preference, the benefits that they would get from it, and the crop that they're currently producing. Of course, obviously, land that is flat or gently rolling, so something that is, minimizes engineering costs and complexity to build on, is typically developers' first preference. Also helps with, not disturbing soil on slopes and creating erosion issues. Generally, land that's being sought should not be a federal or state wetland. So just because if you have a big parcel, if some part of it is a federal or state wetland, that doesn't mean that it's a problem. But definitely the part that would be leased for a facility typically should not be on a wetland. It typically should be a little bit of a distance away from any wetland. The land also should not be protected for historic or archaeological reasons, part of the state preservation rules, and it shouldn't have outstanding liens on it. I'll talk about mortgages a little bit later on. So for medium to larger commercial, industrial, and community facilities, land should typically have 3-phase distribution electric lines on the road near the property. Occasionally they cross the property, but usually distribution lines are on the actual roads because they serve the loads, they serve the businesses and the homes and the farms. Small commercial or small community facilities can get away and sometimes often use single-phase lines. But for any of the larger, medium and larger facilities, typically they want to have 3-phase distribution lines. And as many of you know, that's simply identified by having 3 wires on top of the pole. And the actual voltage and load capacity of those lines are things that developers and engineers look at in great detail. And for utility scale facilities that are yet to come in New York, those will be a little different. Those are typically trying to connect to sub-transmission or transmission lines. So when we have substations across our counties and our towns, a substation is typically a place where we transition from sub-transmission or transmission to distribution lines. So the utility scale solar is typically going to connect on the other side of that substation from the kind of residential, commercial, community, and industrial solar. So what is the scope of the land use? So one really important thing that I like to emphasize and that we'll talk a little bit about later on with municipal best practices is that the amount of solar that can be put in and therefore the land use will fundamentally be limited in the short and medium term by the distribution and transmission grids. And I think that's something that's really interesting and important to talk about, and we'll talk about more in a little bit. Obviously local zoning and the success of the state policies also are driving the volume of development. Some points about land use for the Clean Energy Standard proceeding that's ongoing. Number one, the Clean Energy Standard is really intended to promote a lot of different renewable technologies, and solar is just a really important one of those. And so there have been some concerns shared about how much solar development will happen in my town or my area, and does the Clean Energy Standard have kind of a ridiculously large kind of plan or goal for how much land solar will use. And I just thought it was important to note that number one, the Clean Energy Standard is not just about solar, it's about a lot of different technologies. But if those, if those two numbers were correct, we'd be looking at about 2,900 megawatts of solar, and even if it was all ground mounted, we'd be talking about 14,000 acres of land in New York, which is about 0.2% of New York's currently, cultivated farmland, or about 0.04% of New York's total land area. So I think it is very important to kind of keep this in a sense of scale or perspective. In addition, NYSEIA would really like to and is working to see more utility scale solar come online and have it come online more rapidly than what's been proposed so far in the Clean Energy Standard. But even with that, and it would be, even with that, and the fact that it would be extremely unlikely that all of this would come from solar, if it all came from solar and it was all ground mounted, again, incredibly unlikely, we'd be talking about 2% of New York's farmland or about 0.4% of New York's total land area. So those are still pretty small numbers. So impacts on land. This is obviously a really important point. As we mentioned, solar facilities are not typically located in wetlands or conservation or park areas. They're not typically located on really steep slopes or lake shores, steep lake shores. Solar facilities are as low impact. And by when we say low impact, again, we're really talking about leaving a lot of pervious surface. So using little or no concrete. We're not paving, we're not concreting big areas. And yes, 60% typically, even just between the solar panels, is left as open space, and over 99% is typically natural vegetation. In addition, solar facilities have been extensively reviewed and will continue to be, and have been found to have little or no impact on a number of things, at least the scale of stuff that we've been doing here in New York, stormwater management, glare impact, and impact on wildlife, even with larger facilities, especially if wildlife-friendly fencing is used. So we've really seen little or no impacts from all of these typical things that folks look at when they look at development. So impacts on neighbors and property values. So to date in New York, there's been no evidence at all documented of solar facilities of the scale constructed having any negative impact on neighboring property values. And some of the reasons for this, I think, are relatively kind of straightforward when looked at. They're not making any on-site pollution. They're not making any on-site discernible noise. They don't typically have on-site lighting. They might have some emergency lighting that would be only operated manually in a very rare case. They're not increasing traffic. They are, as I mentioned, retaining most of the natural vegetation and having minimum impacts on stormwater and hydrology. Low profile. These things are not hundreds of feet in the air, although there's nothing wrong with that, but these are low profile infrastructure developments, so they're 10 to 12 foot maximum in height. In addition, there's options for landscaping and buffering from particular areas, like residential areas in certain cases. So all the data that we've seen is impacts on neighbors and property values definitely have not been shown to be negative. And in fact, most of the conversation so far has been about the added value to the property itself, but we have not seen problems being caused for neighbors. So solar developers, in terms of land leasing, we want to kind of walk through one of the big areas of conversation that's really great is about land leasing best practices. What are some key things that are important to have in a land lease? How are these leases being structured? Who's involved? So we just want to kind of intro to this by saying that just developers and our membership has a lot of different approaches and processes for land leasing, and not everybody does the exact same flavor, the exact same thing, but that's okay. We've really done our best here to include the general process and key areas of importance, while still recognizing that there could be many ways to do this well. So the leases themselves, some really basic boilerplate stuff. They're detailed contracts. We definitely recommend that all landowners seek legal counsel from trusted attorneys. There's a lot of great attorneys in the state that have done other types of land development and leasing and are getting very interested in this issue and are generally very good resources. Asking the company generally questions, lots of questions about their lease is always better, and you'll have a lot more sense of what questions you might want to ask at the end of us actually going through some of these best practices, but just trying to make sure the project in question might be the right fit for you. In addition, just wanted to point out that when we say solar developers, sometimes that's one party, but sometimes there's a bunch of different parties involved under that name or that access over time, and this is normal. And so there's lots of different roles, and when people work together under one project umbrella, they have clear lines of responsibility, but there might be actually different folks that you deal with as a landowner, for example. So some of those different roles that exist for projects are land agents. Some companies do their own land development in-house. Some have land agent partners, partners that just go around and help them develop land. Some folks do their own development and then go on to do the engineering, procurement, and construction themselves. Sometimes there is a different early developer who then passes it off to an actual firm or hires a firm to do the construction and engineering. The operator can often be one of those two players, but not absolutely every time. The owner, again, can be one of those folks, but sometimes there are third-party owners. And then there's always the financing folks, which again can be outside. So it sounds like a lot of people, there's definitely not typically all these folks, but these are the different roles that can be done under one house or divvied up between a couple in a well-organized and responsible fashion. So just if you are a landowner and you end up like hearing, seeing different pieces of this, this is what's going on, is that there are a couple different jobs to do and folks that partner to work together to get those jobs done efficiently and properly. So the typical land lease process, some of the big steps here. Number one, the process can be initiated from either side, the developer side, the landowner side. The first thing that always happens is an initial screening of the land. So like we were talking about, if you're looking for what's being built today, a commercial or community site for solar, what kind of distribution lines are there, what kind of topography, all the things we just kind of talked about. What would make a site suitable, and kind of reviewing initially this land for its compatibility with those qualifications. The developer then presents the landowner typically with an option to lease, or it can be to purchase. But the option to lease agreement typically is an option period during which the developer actually reviews the site in more detail and actually moves forward and looking and pursuing the permits and the approvals, which can be for actually permitting the facility locally as well as the utility interconnection and related studies. And for this time period and this work that's being done, during the time period, the landowner is paid a one-time flat fee. The landowner then, so that's what the agreement will be about. The landowner reviews the agreement, they negotiate any changes, and then obviously if they were happy and satisfied and excited about the agreement, they would sign it and move forward. So that would happen, and then the work I just mentioned with the developer reviewing the site in more detail and pursuing the various things would follow the signing of the agreement. I think a lot of developers want just landowners to understand that it is important to understand that once the option agreement is signed, the developer does typically invest a bunch of money into understanding whether this site is a really good fit and actually developing it and permitting it. And until that's completed, they don't know 100% sure, for certain if the site will be viable. If the developer is successful in obtaining the permits and the interconnection costs are reasonable and feasible, then typically the developer will go ahead and exercise that option to lease or to purchase the land. And then the formal lease period itself and the payments, so the first fee was basically for the evaluation of the land and pursuing that option. And then the actual kind of regular lease payments start after that, once the developer has decided to exercise that option. Those payments can be annual or biannual. They often start at the start of construction, although sometimes it can be a different rate until the project's actually completed. The leases themselves are typically for a minimum of 25 years. The two main reasons for that are project financing. Often kind of requires that length of time to make the kind of all the numbers work for the parties involved. Also, it's also the equipment's minimum life. So solar panels typically have a 25 minimum life warranty, and so it makes sense to line up those two things. Extensions on the lease term are common. They can be included up front, one or two extension options that a landowner can agree to and obviously be compensated for, or they can be by mutual agreement later on. And then of course I'll talk more about this in the municipal section, but at the end of its useful life, the facility is definitely decommissioned and removed. So some of the best practices, so that was kind of the overall process. Some of the best practices, number one, so all of these are things that the lease agreement should typically have, include, and these are things that we've just seen from lots and lots of examples across the state and in other states. So typically these leases should include an upfront fee, as we mentioned, paid to the landowner for that option period. And through that period, the landowner is still free to do whatever they normally do with the land. But that option period, again, is for the developer to be reviewing and pursuing the feasibility of the site. The lease should typically be clear about the area available to be leased. under the option, so the landowner really has a decent sense of where this would go, and that includes any access easements or utility easements. Usually there's a detailed scope recommended or should have of what kind of alterations to the property, the leased part of the property, that would be allowed. So sometimes it's just some bounds, a maximum height of infrastructure, whether there's roads or buildings going to be constructed, general vegetation plan changes, signage, etc. Obviously the lease should typically specify a lease payment that begins, and as we said, it begins typically after the option is exercised at construction. And these payments can be, per acre is probably the most common. They can be a specific amount though, or they could be per megawatt as well. And the actual payment amount is typically based on prevailing land values. It is typically higher by far than tenant farming rates. And it is somewhat dependent upon like electric rates in the area, because electric rates in the area drive the value of the project. Like the output of the solar facility is worth more when there are higher rates, and so the project can afford sometimes to pay more for the land lease. So it's prevailing land values and the value of the electricity in the area that tends to drive the price per acre or per megawatt for the actual land lease. And again, these are payments that go on, for 25-year typical minimum period, and then you either have, extensions that are already built in or the option to have extensions. So typically lease agreements should also have provisions for maintenance. Obviously, it's clear that maintenance should be done on the lease parcel, and usually what's really important is to be sure that they specify the allowed property, maintenance or management techniques. So a lot of times we see in leases, that vegetation management or maintenance should be done without chemicals. This is just an example. That's a common thing that people do, and I'm sure there's lots of other options besides that, but there should be, particularly when landowners care, there should be some specification about how the maintenance is done. The leases also typically prohibit the landowner from doing anything on the remaining property around the lease area that would shade or interfere with the solar resource of the leased area. I mean, that makes sense, right? We're putting a solar facility here. We don't want to have somebody put up a building next to it, a barn next to it, plant trees next to it a couple years from now and shade the value, or shade the project and reduce therefore the value of the asset and its production. So that's typically a stipulation. In addition, leases also typically address passive vegetation growth on the landowner's remaining property, something that's not like an active choice of the landowner, but could just happen. This can just grow over time here. And usually they do that by granting the developer or the tenant the right to keep the vegetation on the unleased area down, within a certain radius using specific, again, agreed to above management techniques. Some additional best practices for the leases should typically have the developer, the tenant, be responsible for increased taxes. And this one, mainly I'm talking about increased taxes on property due to the solar. So, when you're putting solar on land, right now there is a 15-year property tax exemption for solar that's a state policy. But as we'll talk about a bit later, it's not quite as simple as that. So just as a good best practice, really the landowner should not be responsible. Instead, the developer tenant should be responsible for any increase in property taxes due to solar, which can be because the assessed value of the land goes up due to solar and it is taxable. The exemption doesn't apply for some reason, or if the assessment methodology is reclassified, if you move from like a comp-based assessment methodology to a commercial-based assessment methodology, which may not be common for the amount of revenue we're talking about, but is something that should be covered. And then also the agricultural exemption. Right now, solar does not, qualify to continue the ag exemption for the actual acreage that it's on. So that if you had property that had that exemption and you put solar on it, it typically would be lost at this point, the exemption, and that should be typically made up for in the lease agreement. The lease agreements also, it's good practice to include discussion of how it would be handled if there was an upfront one-time penalty or conversion fee for the acreage removed from agricultural exemption. So again, the ag exemption is something that we know about. There'll probably be hopefully some changes to the way that's treated in the future, but right now, if it is a little bit of a negative impact for taking it out of ag exemption and there's a one-time fee for that as well, that should be discussed and handled within the lease. In addition, the lease should typically specify how base property taxes, so nothing to do with the solar, but how those are treated. Often we see that those are remaining the landowner's responsibility, and the developer or tenant is taking responsibility for everything in addition to that due to the solar, as I just discussed. But it could be done different ways, but as long as it's very clear whose responsibility those are, and that again, everybody's, everything's adjusted accordingly. Leases typically specify that if there's a mortgage on the property, that the developer will require the bank that's providing that mortgage to sign a non-disturbance agreement, or an NDA, which just means that if for some reason the bank had to foreclose on the property, that they are free to do that, but they would not disturb the solar as long as it was in general compliance and good standing. And future mortgages are also possible with the same kind of NDA. Also, of course, that part of land could always be subdivided, and there are other options beyond that in terms of just keeping it simple for future mortgaging of other property that the landowner has. All right, so I think this is the last page on what lease agreements should typically include. Some of the last few things, one, including the permitting. So the permitting, it's not something that's pushed on the landowner. It's typically the responsibility of the developer to deal with the local jurisdictions, to walk through the whole process, to handle and pay for all of that. And so just it should be clear that that's the case. Also, typically lease agreements require that the developer tenant have liability and property insurance, which they have to have for all of the other agreements that they do to actually sell the electricity anyway. And then, all of these agreements typically include a transfer of them to successors, heirs, or new owners. So on the landowner side, for example, as well as on the developer side or the owner side of the facility. And finally, lease agreements, as I mentioned earlier, should have good decommissioning, or as they call abandonment sections, what happens at the end of the project's life, or if it's ever not operational for some period of time. And for example, many leases require that at the end of the facility's operation, that all above ground and below ground equipment and structures and foundations, if applicable, be removed. I mean, that's one common way to do it. But it should have something specific and clear. And one neat thing about decommissioning is that, and I'll talk more about this in the municipal section, is that it typically is assured by this legal contract that it could be enforced, but also importantly the scrap value of the facility. With the numbers that we're seeing back and that we've seen back in other states, the value of the aluminum and steel and copper from the facility is typically exceeding the cost of the removal. And so that's also like another way that the decommissioning of the facility, there's some confidence that it will occur and be assured. And finally, if the lease that you're looking at includes a provision giving the developer the first right to purchase the land, if indeed you go to sell it, or if it gives the developer an exclusivity zone, meaning if you had other land in a certain area, that there were restrictions on what you could do with that for solar. We just recommend that the landowner, these are not always bad things at all, but we recommend that the landowner should just clearly understand those provisions and discuss them with their attorney. So that's the highlights on land leasing best practices, and I know we're at about 15 to 20 minutes to the hour. I want to spend a few minutes on municipal best practices, and then we'd love to do some questions and answers. So, sometimes how does municipal relate to landowners and land leasing? Obviously, when landowners have questions, they often look to their local governments. Local governments are driving, where and how this happens through their zoning and through some of their other policies, like property tax policies. So we do think the two fit really well together and are both essential to making solar be deployed in a helpful, reasonable, efficient, and beneficial way for as many parties as possible. So municipalities, some of the key areas for you guys is in our opinion, is really understanding the scale and pace of possible solar development and the benefits that it could bring to your constituents. Its zoning and permitting policy and its property tax policy. And so I'm just going to walk through each of these quickly. So first, on the scale and pace of possible development, I mean, we get lots and lots of questions from communities who are excited about solar, but also like, whoa, how do I know how much of this is coming and where it's going to go, and I'm not ready, like I don't have any rules in place. And so I think some of the important points that we found are really valuable for municipalities to hear on that are, number one, currently with solar only connecting to the distribution system, the near-term possible solar in any jurisdiction can easily be estimated from the details of that distribution system, which we can now see through maps. Like this is part of an example map I have down below. It's just obviously a fine line of it, a piece of it, but those are all different types of electrical distribution lines in a particular utility territory, and showing a lot of parameters about them. We get even more information when we work directly with the utility about certain circuits, so we can know in a given municipality what the estimated capacity in the near term for solar is, period, and then also where it could go. So as the second bullet points out, really being able to share this with municipalities and say, here's where development would likely go, here's how much could actually physically happen. And when I say physically happen, I mean that you get to a certain amount of solar deployment on the distribution grid in any town, which is not really that huge right now, and you run into big cost hurdles, something that is going to stall and halt the development on those circuits for some time. And so the combination of these two things means that really, what we're seeing is most towns and municipalities, when we look at them, they're not typically at risk for having a huge, overwhelming amount of solar development in the near term. They're going to have healthy development, and they have some good opportunities, some exciting opportunities, but there are fundamental limitations, driven by costs and actual system feasibility that are going to make this a gradual process and not suddenly their entire town be blanketed with solar. And we are happy, NYSEIA and other folks were happy to show this and help municipalities actually look at their towns on a case-by-case basis. I mean, all of this is public, a lot of it's publicly accessible information, and I think it's really valuable to see the location and scales possible. And as a result of this, what we found is that a number of municipalities who were kind of concerned and just we're trying to get up to speed on what to do, have, once they've seen this information and reviewed it themselves, they often find that they don't really need to pause or have any kind of moratorium as they do solar policies such as zoning and property tax, that they feel like the near-term possibility is manageable. And they can develop those policies simultaneously, which we think is really a very positive thing. So zoning and permitting, some common best practices for these two, or for this topic. So number one, if you're in a town or part of the town government and you don't have solar-specific zoning, the number one thing that would be helpful and I guess I would say valuable is to ensure that it's possible for a solar project, community, commercial, industrial size projects, at the very least, to go through your existing process, and actually, whether that's existing site plan review or special permit process, but to actually be able to go through that and potentially obtain a permit and authorization to be built. The biggest roadblock if you don't have solar-specific zoning is if you just say if everything else is by default prohibited, then that's going to be very difficult to bring the benefits of solar to your town and actually get that going. If you do have solar-specific zoning, or you want to have solar-specific zoning, then there's some more specific things that we can kind of note have been best practices to date, and striking a nice balance between making sure solar is where you want it, and of course that it's done properly, but really giving it clear rules and guidelines and encouraging its growth in a lot of ways, as it is such a low impact and positive type of infrastructure. So some of those best practices that we've seen towns adopting, one would be allowing all scales of solar generally, so residential as well as community, commercial, industrial, and utility. Also allowing primary and accessory structures, solar primary and accessory structures. So we found a lot of towns back when solar in New York was just residential had solar-specific zoning, but had just by default defined solar as an accessory structure, meaning it's like a garage or an outbuilding. And so when you have solar facilities like community farms or a commercial solar field, those aren't accessory structures. So allowing it as both primary and accessory is really quite important. In addition, a lot of folks who have or are updating or putting in place their solar-specific zoning choose to have a couple of categories of facilities, of solar facilities, and the couple of different categories, each category has a slightly different requirement for approval, and sometimes at least the larger category might be possibly permitted in different zones. So for example, roof-mounted facilities are often allowed in all zones, period, without a permit. I'm sorry, with a permit. But without any other process, because they're on existing buildings, they're integrated into those buildings. Sometimes there's another rule or two about how they interface with the buildings, but generally that's a pretty simple category. Minor ground-mounted is typically another category, a second category, and those are often allowed in all zones as well with a permit, but they do typically have to definitely meet some other certain requirements. And then there's major ground-mounted facilities, which are often allowed in many zones or most zones, but not necessarily all. and they do have to meet certain requirements, and they have to go successfully through a site plan review process. And I know a lot of people are curious about, what size projects, what's the cutoff for minor versus major. We've seen a lot of different things done, and NYSEIA actually has not put forward a recommendation on this yet. But we do hear from a lot of folks, a minor system, could be as much as a megawatt or more, and a major system would be over that. And so I think, as we kind of process this more, we will have some more specific recommendations for what that size cutoff could be, and we definitely know what the cutoff has been for some towns to date. We're happy to share that. But it is something where the idea is that things that are really low impact and just not that large should be able to move through just according to certain rules clearly. And then things that are larger, still low impact, but just need more review, more attention to neighbors or landscaping or exact location, then those have a site plan review process when they get to be the larger facilities. So some other things that are best practice, when you're having those categories, setting those kind of requirements as was mentioned for the minor and major, and sometimes for the roof. But for the ground-mounted categories, common requirements like setbacks, height maximums, those are very helpful, very common. In addition, requiring items in the site plan review process for major systems, like that list there, like the list here on this slide. And we've seen things that range from just consideration of vegetation removal and impervious services, like with other development, review of stormwater impacts, review of glare, review of landscaping and fencing, although it's not typically been a requirement, but see if it is necessary for some reason, signage review, and then a decommissioning review of the timeline plan and the standards for that. And in either approach, whether you don't have solar-specific zoning or you do or want to, most jurisdictions, most municipalities plan to act as the lead agency for the seeker process during permitting. So solar right now is an unclassified action in New York. It's just never been taken the time to be classified. And so typically it does not trigger a long form or an actual study, but just simply requires a short form seeker. So the last municipal issue I wanted to touch on before we do some questions was property tax. And so a lot of you have heard, I would assume have heard about property tax and solar. NYSEIA did a webinar on it back in 2014. But New York basically has a law that provides a property tax exemption for the value that solar adds to a property or a facility. And that exemption is for 15 years from the construction completion date. And this is all in the New York Real Property Tax Law 487 section. And this has been around for a long time, since the 1990s. It was just extended through 2025, and basically it's a state saying that, hey, solar is really important, it's really valuable, please don't put property tax on it, that might discourage it or would discourage it. But there is a local opt-in, opt-out provision to this. So municipalities, counties, and school districts, they do provide, all of you provide this exemption by default per state law, but and you must pass a local law or resolution to opt out of it, but you can do that if you choose to. And so just wanted to quickly touch on what that means. Opting out is choosing not to offer the exemption, and some of the points that we wanted to make about that. And again, this is something that can be customized at a municipality by municipality basis, but opting out typically discourages solar development in your town or in your in your municipality. And that's because the additional costs from that can really actually quite significantly impact the economics of projects, even if it's not that large of amount of money, or just the taxation process in general and the uncertainties about the exact number can discourage financing and make financiers uncomfortable. So what we recommend is really that it's a really important presentation for every municipality, county, and school district who's considering this or looking at this issue to see is one that focuses on the economic benefits of providing the exemption. There are benefits from the solar development side of things through increased jobs, business growth, you're expanding facilities, and you're paying increasing levels of property tax and sales tax. Those benefits versus the additional tax revenue from the solar directly. When we've seen a lot of our member companies model this for, for municipalities, for example, the actual additional revenue from taxing the solar directly ends up to often be a very small number, and particularly compared to the economic benefits that the town may likely be able to receive from the growth of the industry itself. So it's definitely, I think, a presentation definitely worth seeing those numbers quantified based on what kind of local jurisdiction you are, what your tax rate is, and therefore what the revenue would be. In addition, I think it's important to note that jurisdictions you can remain in providing the property tax exemption, and you can still do pilots or payments in lieu of taxes for large facilities. So just if you want to provide the exemption to residential solar and community solar and business solar, but you say, hey, if a big facility comes in, I want to be able to to do something with that, you can do that by staying in the exemption. The exemption gives you the full right to negotiate pilots for larger facilities. And I think on that note, I'd love to maybe take some questions. Valessa, if you could walk us through if there are questions that have come in through the chat portal, or if we, looks like there are, so we could probably start with those.
Absolutely, there are. Adam, do you want to take that first one?
Yeah, sure. So there's a question from Stan that is essentially asking that we go over some of the arguments as to why a town shouldn't do what some Broome County towns are looking at, which are opt-outs of the tax exemption and also possibly moratoria, and that these may be motivated by deep concerns that towns have with the New York tax cap that limits their taxation abilities. I think Melissa already covered some of those. Essentially, if you opt out, not only can't you have these larger projects, you won't be able to have likely any projects at all, because the economics will affect rooftop homeowner arrays as well, and that won't make them very happy. On the positive side, as Melissa said, you have the pilot agreement route for large systems and industrial scale systems. And when businesses and residences are able to control their electric costs and fix them over decades, that makes the businesses more competitive and makes the homeowners have income freed up for local consumption. So really what you're doing is hoping for a minimum amount of tax money if you tax directly on these projects, which will likely result in little or no money anyway, because development will be strongly discouraged in our region, or you have other ways of directly or indirectly capturing income.
Right. No, I think that's a good point, Adam. This is Melissa. I mean, I think that generally I think towns and other jurisdictions, it's really helpful to look at the actual potential revenue on the property tax side, and the numbers that we've been seeing, and they're all transparent, aren't very high. And so really, like you said, not having that development, it seems like a lot of times most towns we're seeing seem like they can benefit and are confident they can benefit more by not opting out, but instead providing it and benefiting from the local development that the solar is bringing. So I think to take another question, I know we're down to just a couple minutes, so maybe just take another question. We have a question about how can so much of the project area remain pervious? It's a great question. All I mentioned was there was not, typically much or any concrete used, but what is used and what you see here in the picture that's on the slide that's at the end here with questions is driven piles. So the reason that so much of the land can remain pervious is that all we're putting into the ground is we're driving steel piles, which there's one every 10 or 15 feet, and typically only one row of piles per row of solar. So when you actually do the square footage math, it is over 90, it's like 99% remains natural vegetation. Now the solar does hang over some of that, but water is, because of that, the surface underneath the solar is still pervious, as is of course the space between the rows. And yes, like the vegetation, even if it's left under the panels, the water can run to the front of the edge of the panels. I mean, absolutely, that's why we do look at stormwater management, but generally what we're saying is that we're not, it's still, according to folks at the state and other places, people are generally of the opinion that solar is not an impervious surface, it's simply redirecting some water over some existing pervious surface.
Melissa, I want to move to a couple of the leasing questions because we're at our last 2 minutes, and I'll let folks know that we will be able to save the questions here, so we can follow up with you offline if your question is not answered. So one of the questions was, is there a sample lease that can be shared following this presentation? I don't know if that's a possibility.
I mean, it's a great question, and I would say we will be able to get back to you shortly. We've been asked for model zoning and model leases. And so this was kind of our first step to kind of organize our information for the industry to be able to get out there. We're definitely considering doing both of those things, and we should have an update on that shortly.
And then along the leasing lines, there's a question, do or should developers perform a full survey of the property and provide a site plan to the landowner before the lease option is signed?
I mean, definitely like a full survey is part of the process, and as is a site plan. I think it depends on the developer when exactly those are put in the hands of the landowner. I mean, I think the way that we addressed it here for now was that we definitely feel strongly that landowners should have a very, very good idea of where this is going, you know, before they sign an option agreement. So it shouldn't be, here you have 200 acres, it could go anywhere. There definitely needs to be a better sense of where it's going and what to expect in terms of access and utility easements. Whether that has to be as formal as a survey or formal as a final site plan, I don't think I can comment on that. I mean, it's a pretty early stage of development. I think the key part is the way it's done needs to put some bounds around where this is going, that the landowner can feel confident they know what to expect, and that something doesn't end up in a place on their property that they had absolutely no interest or expectation it would be.
Excellent. And we are at time, so I'm going to skip to this last question, which is, will we be sharing the slides from this presentation? We will be sharing the slides as well as the full recording. I know we did run through everything quite quickly, so I will send that out to this list by the end of the week so you can review the materials. And our contact information is included. Please feel free to reach out to us.
And before we close, I did send this out through the chat box, but in Broome County we're going to be hosting 2 sessions with the PV Trainers Network, one on June 7th at the Broome County Library, one on June 29th at the town of Shenango Hall, and more information for that is at southerntiersolarworks.org, but we will send that out with the other information.
Great. And it does seem like, you know, thank you everyone for joining, and it does seem like there were a lot of questions we didn't get to, so we will do our very best to follow up with some of you who had a lot of questions individually, or make it an FAQ or something to be able to get back to you on those. And thank you again for joining this webinar. We appreciate it and look forward to continuing this conversation.